All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know for some of us it's good evening. For some of us it's good morning, but it's good afternoon in Helsinki. Welcome to today's webinar, Great Power Competition in the 21st Century, More Than a Buzzword. My name is Ville Sinkkonen. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, or FIA, and I have the distinct pleasure of chairing today's event. The notion of great power competition has become a new term of art to describe the fraying relations between the key powers in the international order, not only in terms of the pivotal US, China, Russia triangle, but also more broadly. There is, however, disagreement on what the term actually means and whether it is an apt description of the current era, let alone a useful prescription for navigating the present international predicament. With the help of two authors of a recent edited volume, the Routledge Handbook of Great Power Competition, I will introduce the authors in just a moment, this webinar takes an analytical look at the concept of great power competition and also considers its real-world manifestations and relevance for Europe and the Nordic-Baltic region. Now, for the benefit of full disclosure, I was also involved in this book project. We'll cover a number of questions today. For instance, what are the distinguishing features and definitional boundaries of great power competition? Who are the key actors? Through what mechanisms and with what objectives do great powers engage in this competition? And what are the historical precursors of the current era of great power competition? And what are its possible future trajectories? Without further ado, and for the benefit of time, I'll very briefly introduce our speakers. You will find more substantive bios on the FIA website. Brian C.H. Fong is a professor and associate dean of the College of Social Sciences at National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan and holds adjunct positions at SOAS and University of the Ryukyus in Japan. Brian's research focuses on great power politics, global democracy, and identity politics. And most recently, he is the author of US-China Rivalry, Great Power Competition in the Indo-Pacific with Edinburgh University Press, and the lead editor of the already mentioned Routledge Handbook of Great Power Competition. Thomas F. Lynch III is a distinguished research fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute of National Strategic Studies of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Tom's primary ongoing research is focused on great power competition and on India's strategic rise and implications for Indo-Pacific security and stability. Especially relevant for today, Tom wrote the concluding chapter for the Routledge Handbook of Great Power Competition. He's also edited Strategic Assessment 2020 into a new era of great power competition, which was published with NDU Press. After Brian's and Tom's presentations, we will hear comments from Veera Laine. Veera is a senior researcher at the Strategy Unit of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland, and she has previously worked at FIA as well as the University of Helsinki. Her research interests include nationalism, conceptual change, Russian politics, and the Russian Orthodox Church. And after Veera's comments, I will open the floor for Q&A. And as is customary, you can start typing in questions already during the presentations. And with that short introduction, I will hand it over to you, Brian. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Willie and FIIA for hosting this event. It is my great pleasure to join all the friends here to talk about our handbook and also, broadly speaking, the phenomenon of great power competition, GPC. With limited time, I try to highlight three major critical issues that I think are important for us to understand GPC today. First of all, is what is GPC? Secondly, why we need to study GPC, why it is it has become an important IR phenomenon again. And finally, how to study GPC both empirically and probably from policy analysis perspective as well. So first of all, as a scholar, we of course like to define things. So I need to give a definition about what is GPC first. GPC we can define it as one of the dimension of great power relations. Conceptually, we can classify great power relationships into three types. When two or more great powers they cooperate with each other, we will call it great power cooperation. When two or more great power directly fight against each other in battlefield, we call it the great power war. And great power competition is something in between great power cooperation and great power war, meaning that two or more great powers, they intensely competing with each other by all possible means below the threshold of war. And historically, they are our history. The world history is always dominated by different rounds of GPC great power competitions. For example, in 19th century, we have the British-Russian rivalry in Central Asia. Historians like to call it the Great Game, okay? And in the late 19th century, we have the Japanese and the Russian Empire. They intensely compete in Northeast Asia, including Manchuria and Korean Peninsula. So in this incident finally led to the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century. And before the outbreak of the First World War, we have the British-German rivalry across Europe, and before the outbreak of the Second World War, we have the U.S.-Japan rivalry in the Pacific, and after the Second World War, we have the U.S.-USSR rivalry, which usually called the Cold War, and today we have U.S.-China rivalry. Some people call it the new Cold War or the Cold War 2.0, whatever. But for me, as a scholar, all these kinds of great power competitions, we could conceptualize them as some forms of, as I mentioned, interstate competitions below the threshold of war. And I think it is important for us to conceptualize today's U.S.-China rivalry in this way, so that we can understand it from a historical political perspective and draw on historical insight and lesson to understand our world today. So this is my first point. And the second point is, why do we need to study GPC? The reason is very simple, because GPC has returned as the to the center of world politics spheres today. Here we need to know the background. After the end of the Cold War in 1991, the whole world actually has somehow gone through a relatively stable and peaceful period in the 1990s and 2000 under US unipolarity. In other words, during that 20 years, we didn't have much great power competition because US is dominant power. It has the power to dominate world affairs. So countries like China, Russia, or Iran, they are not in a position that didn't have the power, resources to challenge the US. So because of that, during this 20 years period of time, we didn't have much great power competition, which is somehow a quite abnormal period from a wider historical perspective. As I mentioned, great power competition was actually is always part of our world, but in that 20 years, 2 to 3 decades, GPC has been viewed by US unipolarity. But after 2008, or since the turns of the 2010s, we can argue that US has somehow experienced sorts of relative decay, meaning that the power gap between US and other rival powers has been significantly narrowed, in the sense that countries like China and Russia, they are now in a much stronger relative positions to challenge US. Therefore, bring back GPCs to the center of the world theater. I give you. We can share some simple statistics. We can understand the big picture. For example, in 1991, US share of world GDP is 25%. And at that time, and in 1991, China GDP was only 1.6% of the world total. Today, US still occupy 25% of world GDP, but China share world GDP today has increased from just 1.6% in 1991 to more than 18% today. So we, at least in economically speaking, we are in some sorts of bipolar system. And because of that, China has much more resources to build its army, to use various kinds of economic influence operations, economic assistance to expand its sphere of influence. This is the reason. These are the structural reasons that bring our whole world back to sorts of great power competitions today, and it has become a transformative force that shape different aspect of our world. That's why we need to study GPC. This is my second point that I would like to highlight. Finally, our book, as a handbook, as a scholarly book, we try to provide a framework on how to study GPC today. And in a nutshell, I will argue that GPC today is a very complicated phenomenon that encompasses multiple actors, multiple influence mechanism, and multiple domains. For multiple actors, it means that today, great power competition is of course about great power, but the paradox is it is more than about great power, because in this game, great powers are somehow the main actors, but there are still many other minor actors that could exert certain kinds of influence over the great power game. So US, China, or Russia, they are of course important great powers that are the major actors shaping the whole game. But we still have middle powers like Japan, South Korea, India in Asia, Australia, and in Euro-Atlantic, we have UK, France, Germany, so on and so forth. And different small state or small powers, despite the fact that they are generally not that strong in terms of GDP or military budget, but on certain domains, they may still have leverage to exert certain kinds of influence that shape the political trajectories. For example, in Asia, we have Singapore, which is a financial power, have a lot of influence in trade and regional security, which is able to navigate in between US and China. And in Euro-Atlantic, we have, for example, Estonia, which is a technological power, which is very influential in regional politics. So one of the interesting points that therefore, when we to study great power competitions today is we need to go beyond great power. Of course, we need to bring in big power, trying to figure out their strategic behavior. But apart from that, we also need to pay attention on other countries like middle powers and small power. And very interestingly, apart from state, the so-called sovereign state, the 193 member state of the United Nations, we still have non-state actor and quasi-state. For example, non-state actor, we have terrorist group like Houthi, Hezbollah. They are important. They are weak. Okay, they are weak in general sense, but they are very critical in certain regional geopolitical issues. We have power military forces like the Russians Wagner group, which is also very influential in regional geopolitics. For example, in Ukraine and also in Africa, and transnational corporations are also very influential in great power politics today. For example, the SpaceX owned by Elon Musk is operate the Starlink project, which is critically important in the war between Russia and Ukraine. So this, in other words, today, apart from state, non-state actor, different kinds of non-state actors are also critical actors that we must pay attention to. And very interestingly, today we also have a lot of quasi-state. They are not sovereign state, but they somehow still have their own government, autonomous government. They can navigate in geopolitics. For example, in Euro-Atlantic, we have Greenland, which is an autonomous government, territorial autonomy of the Danish kingdom. It is very influential in navigating in between US, China, and Russia, competitions in the Arctic Ocean. So in other words, today we have much more a lots of actors that we need to take into account when studying great power competitions. And apart from actors, we also have different kinds of influence mechanism, in the sense that when the great powers try to project their power and influence, try to expand their sphere of influence, try to outcompete their rivals, there are many means that they can think about and adopt. And apart from military, apart from launching war, actually there are a lot of non-war military operations today. For example, arms sale. For example, China make use of its arms sale, make a lot of South Asian countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan becoming heavily dependent on it, so as to allow the Chinese to expand its sphere of influence across the Indian subcontinent. And of course, in today's global economy, interconnected economy, controlling trade, and industry, technology, energy, and also finance are also important influence mechanism used by the great powers to yield influence. For example, US will make use of its technological positions to impose semiconductor export control against China, so as to weaken China, or impose financial sanction against Russia in order to try to weaken Russia, so on and so forth. And of course, today, because of the development of social media and internet, information campaign, disinformation campaign, misinformation campaign, as we all know, are very important influence mechanism as well. And finally, we also have a lot of domains today. Apart from geopolitical, geographic regions like Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic, Arctic Ocean, Antarctica, so on and so forth. Today we have a lot of what I call non-territorial borderless domain, such as outer base, cyber base, supply chains, global governance system, and global finance system. So in other words, in a nutshell, we are facing a world of great power competition, and today, the great power competition is very complicated. It involves a lot of actors, involves a lot of different kinds of influence mechanism, many different kinds of domains. I think it poses a great challenge to both we scholar and also policymaker, because the great power competitions today is so complicated, encompassing too many things. In other words, we must try to mobilize multidisciplinary knowledge in order to understand this phenomenon. Of course, we still need political scientists, military experts, security experts for their expertise to understand great power competitions. But on the other hand, we also need economists, trade experts, business, supply chain experts to understand geoeconomics, so on and so forth. Here in Taiwan, my home country now, semiconductor is a very interesting great power competition phenomenon. It involves transnational company, involves different country, involves military technology, and of course commercial technology. So something like semiconductor, we can no longer study it through a single discipline. So how to understand great power competitions today through a multidisciplinary approach? I think this is something that we can explore further and discuss further, perhaps in the Q&A section. So I just stop here because I've already spoken too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, so much for that extremely informative introduction. And I'd like to second Brian's call for multidisciplinary research on this vital topic. With that, over to you, Tom, in Washington, D.C.
Yes, good morning from Washington, D.C. And thank you, Ville and Kirsi and all those at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs who have endeavored to make this possible this morning. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm reminded of the fact that Brian and I have done similar things regarding the topic of great power competition, this book in particular. Most recently, perhaps, Brian, when we met in your home country of Taiwan and presented at the International Affairs Conference there a little over a month ago. Delighted to be able to do this and have a chance to talk. Let me just start by stating that I work at the U.S. National Defense University, but what I'm talking about today and what I've published on with Brian and other sources on great power competition is the result of my own personal research and conclusions, and does not necessarily represent the opinions or the policies of my institution, the National Defense University, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. As noted by Villet, I wrote chapter 24 of this volume and titled that The Future of Great Power Competition. Now, that was written and edited extensively through 2023 and then culminating in early 2024. So I thought what I'd do today is perhaps update and extend a couple of the key themes of that book, because as we've proceeded through 2024, some of the themes and the predictions in that chapter have resonated, and I wanted just to flag those up, if I might, as my contribution today. So I wanted to just do a touch base and then leave multiple minutes here for Vera's comments and then our question and answer by touching on 5 specific areas. First, to extend some of Brian's comments about the relevance and the worthiness of great power competition as a framework for understanding both the geopolitical realities of today and the policy implications that those connote. Second, then, I'd like to highlight what I think are 4 big themes that are resonant as part of the future of great power competition, and I'll get to those in a couple of seconds. Let me start first with the relevance. Is established pretty well kind of the framework and the thinking concept for most of us involved with the Routledge Great Power Competition book, and also that plays out in my own research, which is that in international affairs, of course, leadership and individual choices matter greatly, but so too does the structure of the geopolitical environment, because that historically has conditioned not only the choices of the greatest of the states or the empires, but also the options available to the middle and lesser states. And this framework of thinking is most tied to the intellectual discipline of structural realism. I am an admitted proponent of structural realism, so my analysis fits into that category. But what I think it's important to do is to set out why this, can and should matter, and to engage in the appropriate intellectual debates with those who say great power competition does not really mean that much. We've moved beyond that. I think as an international relations scholar and a historian, nothing could be further from the truth. As Dr. John Mearsheimer has written over time, there is this tragedy of great power politics, which is sometimes dormant in human history and political organization, but it is never gone for long. And I think that's where we are right now. I think we have returned to the future in terms of the structure of the international environment. And when I say that, I mean that most of us in this webinar were not alive the last time that there were 3 or more great powers in a rivalrous competitive state, jousting for power and influence across the globe, right? Most of us grew up in either the period of, as Brian mentioned, American unipolar dominance, where American interests and power from the 1990s through maybe 7-8 years ago pretty much were the way in which most countries of the world had to think about power, influence, and their range of choices. In the previous 45 years, there was a bipolar structure of great power relations that were rivalrous and were not harmonious or collaborative. But they were also discrete and different in that they were relatively static They competed on a periphery, and there was a great separation in the normal state-to-state interactions that was a gulf that never closed. That is, there was not robust economic interaction. There was not robust political and diplomatic interaction. There was not robust cultural exchange and interaction. And the framework was that basically states on the periphery of the American-Russian dynamic basically had to suffer what they would and march either all in line with Moscow or all in line with the United States. A period of 3 or more great powers is distinctly different. 3 or more great powers can never be assured of stasis, like in a bipolar world, and the world can never be assured of some kind of rules and norms that are standard, nor can the world be assured that great powers may not waver or flex in terms of who they align with other great powers. This makes for much greater fluidity. And coupled with the fact, as Brian mentioned, that powers rise and decline relative to each other, and therefore joust over whose rules, norms, and institutions dominate either the entire global political space or key portions of it, the notion of great power competition is that we are in a very different arena than we have been for 80 years, 3 or more great powers that are rivals. But this is not atypical of what human history has been since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We are back in a normal period. It's just that it's not normal for the statesmen of the countries of the world to understand what's happening. And so that's my first point. My first pitch is understanding the importance of the geopolitical structure and how it is shaped by rivalrous great powers with global influence. And when there are 3 or more, that's the important insight that shapes and conditions other decisions. So what does that mean in terms of today and the future of great power competition? Well, we are still arguably evolving from a period of American unipolar ascendance, where the rules and the aspirations of others all flowed through Washington, to a point now where Moscow and China are much more assertive, much more divergent in how they see the global rules, norms, institutions, and procedures that should be followed. And as a consequence, we are evolved right now in returning to history, as I say it, from a unipolar moment to a moment of multipolar great power competition, where the powers themselves are recombining and realigning, as we've seen the Russians and the Chinese do recently. But we shouldn't suspend our disbelief as to whether or not that alignment set could change once more. So what I see happening right now, given the influence of history and this return to history, are 4 major things. First, because the US is no longer the dominant global power, and because the US polity has come to realize this, particularly in the last 7 to 8 years, the other great powers and all other countries are coming to understand that the US as an international political presence is no longer a constant, meaning a dominant locus of power and influence, but rather it is a variable and must be seen for what changes in terms of American political preferences, but that may not match American power to actually execute. Think particularly execute or implement on the periphery of the other great powers, okay? Reduced power, reduced interests, and being a variable instead of a constant in terms of influence. Second, we are going through something last witnessed at the end of the Gilded Age and as World War I broke out, and that is multi-state great power cooperation and collaboration coming to an end, and domain fragmentation, whether it be supply chains or means of communication or how people travel, these areas are starting to fragment. Things that have been assumed in most of our lives as being constant, the ability to travel to any country in the world, the ability to reach out through the internet over the last 25 years and touch point with every place now, maybe except for China and some others. These domains are fragmenting. And over the next 5 to 10 years, history and the logic of great power competition in a multipolar era suggest that we should see these fragment even further, that it's harder and harder to get global internet connectivity. It becomes more difficult to travel freely from one great power to another, or from great power allies to another. Supply chains will be broken and separated, where great powers will try to control and make certain the securitization of their supply chains. This is all logical and predictive by great power analysis, and therefore we should expect that, and policymakers around the globe should expect that. Third, the competition for what the rules, norms, and procedures are for international activities are now really going to be contested in what's referred to as the Global South. And I can go into that in question and answer in a little more detail. But we've ended a period where great power rivalry really centered, particularly with respect to China, on trying to contest and establish rules, norms, and procedures by power of attraction and economic cooperation, particularly with states in North America and Europe. That decade-plus long period has come to an end through a combination of issues: China's response to COVID and Europe's disdain for that, China's support of Russia in Ukraine, and Europe's disappointment and disgust with that. But China, importantly, has recognized that. And China has turned over the last 3 years to a number of proclamations by President Xi declaring something that Washington has slowly woken up to and that Moscow already knew. And that is the future of rules, norms, and procedures, particularly the role of the individual versus the role of the state. Those are going to be competed for in the states of the Global South: Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America. It is these countries that China is trying to woo actively right now into its understanding of appropriate ideology applied to rules, norms, and institutions. And if the current institutions don't bend in the direction of China, then China is establishing alternative institutions to set in their place. What they're looking for is cooperation with states of the Global South to build a critical mass in that direction. And slow to the mark, Washington has started to figure this out. And so the point is, the next 5 to 10 years, we should expect intensifying competition in the Global South between all three of the great powers, but especially the US and China, over this issue of norms and procedures. And finally, great power competition is not an exclusive club or set. That is, states can rise and fall in relative power to one another. That is the norm in history, particularly if you look in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And so we should be alert to the fact that a great power is either capitulating and losing sufficient power that it declines from the ranks of the globally influential great power state and more of a middle state. And we should be alert for those that are rising and ascending with global aspiration, global reach, and global influence across the multiple areas of difference. I've been trying to look at that carefully, and particularly to project certainly 5 years out. It's always fraught to predict further out than that, but maybe out to 10 years. And the most logical changes in great power status are not about the US and China. That is likely to be a rivalrous great power dyad that evolves over decades, not years. But secondly, that Russia's enormous wastage of power right now is important, but unlikely in the next 5 and even 10 years to see Russia decline as an international, powerful, great power. Mr. Putin is set in his mind to not have that happen, and history tells us that great powers die hard. The Ottoman Empire dragged on for 150 or 70 years when it was decaying and decrepit. Russia itself has declined or been defeated badly by powers like the Japanese or the Germans, and still resurrected and remained a global great power. Russia is wasted, and Russia is looking for great power partners like China right now, but it is not likely to decline from the ranks anytime soon. Second, the country with the most latent power to become a great power and join the three and make it an issue of 4 is now, and has been for a while, India. But India has its own self-limitations, and I write about them in this chapter of the book. Let me just say for now, though, that India does not seem likely to have the power and the influence or the aspiration to project that globally. But India is expressing an appetite to stand up against the great powers and partition and take what it wants from great power relations, economics with China, security with the United States, political and diplomatic comfort from Russia. And India has been willing to challenge, particularly China, in terms of China's view and effort to ascend in the global south. And so India is a critical player, not because it's going to become a great power, but it's going to be a friction point amongst the great powers because of the reach and the heft that it has. And I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and look forward to the comments of Lena. And I thank the organizers again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Tom. A lot of food for thought in those remarks. Now, I will hand the floor over to Vera for comments and remind the audience that the chat is open and looking forward to turning it into Q&A after Vera's comments. So go ahead, Vera.
Thank you. Thank you, Ville, and thank you for the invitation to this webinar. It's been a true pleasure. And thank you, both Brian and Tom, for these very inspiring and interesting presentations, and as well as your contributions to this impressive book that I hope many of us online will have the chance to look at soon, because in my view it truly makes a great contribution with this integrative analytical framework that you described, combining and connecting all those existing theories of great power competition, and also in that way giving suggestions for future studies in the field. So I really enjoyed reading your chapters of the book, and then of course hearing you updating and deepening those insights in these two presentations. I would like to just raise a couple of points before our Q&A. Firstly, I of course fully agree that there is relevance to this study, as you say, that this great power politics or competition, it has come back, and I think the theories produced in those other countries than those that represent great powers, I think those have been more eager to see the great power politics come back. I mean that, for example, those challenging the current world order have probably been producing theories already earlier about this end of the moment of unipolar moment of world history. For example, in this Russian research literature, it has been quite a dominant discourse for a while that this national distinctiveness, for example, should be regarded as a world order principle, and that Russia has a certain mission in the world. So that kind of discourses have come quite early on, already in the 1990s, to the theory debates in Russia, and I think it must be true for China as well. Of course, the research there can be seen also as an influence mechanism. So that's we should not put too much weight on those theories, but nevertheless, what your presentations very well illustrate is this sort of triangle of US-China rivalry, and then at the same time there is this cooperation between Russia and China, which is not to say that there would not be aspects of rivalry between those two as well, but the highly asymmetric position between Russia and China has in a way it is so clear that in one way this rivalry is pretty much over as we see it today. I would like to, because of this kind of triangle of great power competition, I would like to go back to the idea of these attributes of great power actors. What makes a great power great? And I very much like your theorization of those attributes and the discussion. And even if the economic capabilities have probably been stressed more in recent times, as you also show in these multiple domains of competition, there are also other quite important attributes of great powerness that are not necessarily directly military or economic. And I mean here, for example, energy self-sufficiency or population or logistics and territory, and then of course partnerships. And for example, I would like to you to perhaps elaborate a little bit on this Russia's position as or status as a great power today, when a lot of its great powerness is dependent, in my view, on this partnership with China. So would Russia today be a real global power without China's support? If we think that Russia has, of course, the aspiration to be a great power and has always had, but it has also experienced great losses because of the war of aggression in Ukraine that it started. So my question would be that what is it that actually keeps Russia from falling into the category of regional great power, so to say? It sounds like a simple question, but I think, and you, Tom, already touched upon this as well by mentioning the competition in the so-called global South countries. But I still think that Russia's influence or presence in the global South is less equipped materially than other great powers and in this domain. And this example brings me to my other question, which is actually more theoretical. Would you be able to see these categories of powers? Because I really like your point that it is not only great powers who influence the great power competition, but there are these middle powers and even small powers who have influence. And in that sense, my question would be that could you perceive these categories between different kind of actors more like a continuum? Because we do see that many of them are in flux and they lose power and they gain power in relation to each other. So would it be possible to understand them on a continuum instead of inside strict categories? And here, of course, I'm thinking about not only Russia, but also India, as was already mentioned, and perhaps the European Union as well. So is there movement in between the categories of, for example, middle great powers and great powers? And this, of course, links to the idea of the power balance in the future. I think I'll stop here. I really enjoyed your insights, and I look forward to your comments and further ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera. What a great set of comments, and definitely a lot to discuss in the coming few minutes. We have 15 minutes, which means that I will pick up the two questions from the chat, and then I will hand the floor over to Brian and Tom to both reply to Vera's comments and then to tackle the two questions in the Q&A. and we will see where we are after that, and we'll see if we can take on a couple more questions. So the first question in the chat is from Emma Lindberg, and the question is very much tied to what Vera has already said about Russia's economic distress and what implications Russia's decline would have for the relationship between the United States and China in this competitive frame. Another question from my colleague Bart Jans is about India, and I suppose this goes more to Tom, but of course Brian, feel free to pitch in as well. Would you say that the US would like to see India as a great power or as a third pole in the global order? What is American thinking with respect to that? And actually from Emma Lindberg, a follow-up question on India, and this I can clump together with Bart's question is how would China view Asia's future with a rising India, or with India actually going from being a power with a lot of latent power to actually entering this great power club. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Brian, please.
Okay, thank you very much for Vera comments and great questions. I've also briefly take a look on those questions posed by some audience. Vera and many audience, it seems that to me that you are all very interested in Russia power position, how we should categorize Russia, so on and so forth, and how it may whether it has the power resources to remain as a great power in the near future, so on and so forth. I think it is an interesting question because it boils down to a critical questions of how to define great power, right? Generally speaking, I think IR scholar will define great power as country that have the power resources to project influence beyond its home territories. Okay, so that's why our scholar always use the term power projection. Okay, great power have the power to project influence to many different places beyond its territory. It is a very general definition. Based on that, some scholar will further divide great power into two types. One is global great power. Another type is regional great power. Global great power means that they are countries that can project powers to all corners of the world. Okay, so today, China and US, I think, unquestionably, they are global great power. Another type is regional great power, meaning that the country are strong, but they are not strong as the global great power. Their influence are largely limited. Power projections are largely limited within their home region. For example, UK, Germany, and France, they are also great power, but they make their influence are mainly within Euro-Atlantic. Or India, Japan, Australia, they are also great power, but they are the sorts of regional great power, mainly focus on Indo-Pacific region. And these are some theoretical typology, but any kinds of classification scheme must have some gray area. And I think Russia is an interesting case that fall somehow in between global great power and regional great power. On certain power metrics, I think Russia is a global great power. For example, it has one of the largest nuclear infantry in the world. It has a large military budget, just follow China and US. It has very strong information manipulation capability, which allow it to interfere domestic politics of all countries around the world. On that sense, Russia is a global great power. But on the other hand, Russia's economy size is very small, as large as Canada, although it's a strong energy, power, natural gas, oil exporting as we know it, but its economic resources is not as large as US and China. In that sense, maybe Russia is just a regional economic great power. So that's something I think Russia is interesting. It depends on how you define great power, what kind of power metrics that you have adopted in classifying great power, then you may have different answer on how to define the positions of Russia. It boils down to another interesting question mentioned by Vera. She asked how we should understand non-Greek power, their positions, their influence in today's Greek power competition, right? I think it is a very interesting question because generally speaking, IR scholar will define Greek power in cross term. In cross term means that we try to define power resources according to some cross metrics, such as GDP and military budget. But today's world is very complicated. Some country, they may be very weak in terms of GDP or military budget, but they may be exceptionally strong in a particular domain. And if that domain is strategically very important, this will make that country very influential. I give you an example, you can understand that Taiwan as a country, it is in any cross power metric, it is not a great power in terms of GDP or military budget. But Taiwan, as we all know, is the premier semiconductor manufacturer today. Okay, it's produced most of the advanced semiconductor in the world. So in last month there was a very interesting news report saying that China trying to press the South African government to expel the Taiwanese diplomatic office out of the capital of South Africa, and in order to prevent to push back China influence, Taiwan government threatened to stop the semiconductor supply to South Africa, and South Africa strongly dependent on Taiwan chips to sustain its economy, including its car making industry. So because of that, it seems that the South Africa government at this stage has postponed its decision. So this is a very interesting example to show that on certain occasion, on certain dimension, on certain domain, a traditionally defined small state or weak state could be a superpower as well. So that's boils down to my conclusion. That's why we need to define or understand great power from a multidisciplinary or holistic perspective. We could no longer just rely on military or traditional security perspective to understand great power politics today. The world is so complicated. Power is holistically divided, have many dimensions. So we really need to adopt different perspective to understand our very complicated world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Over to you, Tom.
Hey, great. Thanks much. And I'm cognizant of the time here. So I think the theme of the questions that we posed and then Vera's wonderful comments take me in two specific bites to try to collectively, hopefully, address all of that. The first is the definition of great power and globalism. Brian and I have had many and lengthy chats on this. I think we are agreed in most parts, but we may be a little bit divergent in some parts. I've spent a lot of time looking at trying to define great powers. I tend to be a little bit wary of pinpoint or pinprick definitions of specific things as making a country great and powerful globally. And I'm a little bit skeptical about regional great powers. I think the international great power framework is the important one to understand that unlocks a deeper and richer understanding of the variables and the choices of policymakers in different regions and in different areas. But first and foremost, one has to understand the great power definitions. That's not just about quantitative things, as Brian suggested, but rather there's a rich vein of literature that I capture in some of my other writings that suggests the best way to understand a global great power is a three prime dimension. And I get into this in like 4 paragraphs in the book chapter, but do much more on it elsewhere. That 3 frame construct is first, does the state have unique and irreplicable capabilities. And since World War II, that unique and irreplicable capability has been nuclear power, nuclear weapons, okay? Nuclear weapons. Second, does that state aspire to project its power, both the nuclear weapons and other unique power capabilities, beyond its immediate neighborhood? Let me say that again. Do they aspire to project their unique capabilities and their power for influence and coercion beyond their immediate neighborhood? And third, and this is where it's very qualitative, how does the rest of the global states perceive that state? That is, does a leader in Latin America and Africa wake up with an initiative one morning and say, wow, what countries in the world do I need to make sure are either with me or against me, are going to support me or going to fight me? And if you're a state that fits those three qualifications, which are all necessary and must together be sufficient, then you're a great power. So let's apply that to Russia. Let's apply that in areas of Russia's global influence, either coercive or attractive. In the political diplomatic sense, Russia is everywhere. Lavrov is everywhere. Lavrov is the statement person for multipolarity paired with the Chinese and all over Latin America, China, South Asia, the stateside country. He's projecting multipolarity. He's projecting anti-Westernism. He matters. Russia matters internationally still to this point, despite its power erosion. Second, militarily, Russia's private military corporations are everywhere. They're in Venezuela. They're in El Salvador. They are in Africa. They are in Southeast Asia. They matter. They aspire to matter. Mr. Putin makes them matter. And even militarily, let me do it militarily. I'll skip economics. Oil still matters. Let me just say that, though, globally. Militarily, Mr. Putin is investing in submarines for the Far Eastern Fleet. He's flying Bear bombers over the Arctic to intimidate Canada and America. He's doing other things. Russia is a declining great power, but it is still a great power. Now let's talk about India. I study India all the time. I love India. And to your question on the chat, yeah, America would like to see India rise as a pole in opposition to China. Right now, it would just like India to be a strategic partner with America because it recognizes that India aspires to ally with no one and wishes to retain strategic autonomy. Corollary to that, India trusts Russia as a better great power partner than either America or China. And that's historical, and we can go into that later. We don't have time for it right now. But what about India and the great power criteria? And why do I say that India matters as a pivot point for the three great powers, but is not likely to become one? Well, let's go back to that definition. Does India have nuclear weapons? Yes, okay. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Two, does India aspire to accomplish great policy precedents and procedures outside of its immediate region? Sorry, the answer is no. Okay? And India itself will show you and demonstrate that it's not building a power projection military. It's got no corner on the market of anything right now economic. And even though its cultural reach of yoga and some other things that Mr. Modi has pushed are nice, they still don't resonate globally. And what about that third criteria? Do other states wake up in the morning and their leaders or their parliamentary heads say, wow, we got to consult India before we decide whether we want to run this up the flagpole at the UN or whether we want to go do something in this other area of the region? And the answer is still no. And those latter two categories are likely still to be no for the foreseeable future. And I could make similar arguments about Japan or Turkey or other places that are potential great powers and that merit looking at, but we have to look at them, I would argue, in terms of those three necessary and sufficient criteria. And this tells us that no matter how much we would like to wish away the Russia problem, Russia remains the obdurate, endurant, great power that it's been for centuries. It's just so big, it's just so feckless, it's just so willing to align and partner with others. And oh, by the way, don't rule out the fact that Russia may not tack back in the direction of the United States. I don't think any of us here living in this town think that Russia might become more friendly with the United States, starting after about January 20th. And the history of great powers would suggest that is logical. Great powers die hard. Russia has moved towards China, even though it has enormous geopolitical issues with China in the Far East and with how they see the world. It's moved there to survive as a great power. And you can love him or hate him, but Mr. Putin's making it work. That doesn't mean that's where they're going to stay for the next 5 to 10 years. They may not want to have their face eaten by the leopard of Beijing. They may not want to give away all their great power resources. And oh, by the way, America as a great power might also not want to see Russia's power assets all aligned in Beijing. And so we may be looking to cut a deal with Russia, either after Mr. Putin or somewhere else. So all I'm saying is the logic of great power competition with 3 or more is very different than what policymakers have lived. And we need to get that vibe in our minds as policymakers or academics and analyze accordingly and think accordingly. Not to say that individual states don't have status or matter, but rather to say how they matter is conditioned by that great power alignment and environment. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Unfortunately, there are some questions on the chat. You luckily touched on the Arctic a bit, but unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a day. I want to thank our speakers, Brian and Tom. It has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much, Vera, for the comments, and to everyone online for following and for the active participation in the chat. With that, we are adjourned for the day. Thank you so much.